After the passage of President Biden's spending bill in the House, progressives in the chamber look to renew efforts to push Biden on top agenda items. Among those is canceling a healthy chunk of student debt. Chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, said on Twitter, quote, "Now let's help everyone and cancel at least $50,000 in student loan debt for everyone." New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called out Biden in the New York Times, saying there's an enormous amount of executive action they're sitting on that I think is underutilized. On student loans with respect to climate, there are certainly things we can do with immigration. And California Congressman Ro Khanna echoed these sentiments when he joined us here on Rising earlier this week.
Really, what gives? I mean, why hasn't the administration been more focused on tackling these things that have delivered him those votes from those young voters?
They should be. And as you know, Ryan knows, I've been a defender of the administration will Build Back Better and even with the bipartisan infrastructure bill. But there is no reason that the president shouldn't sign something to forgive student loan debt in this country. I mean, I've said up to 50,000, but at least do something of 10, 15, 20,000 so that you are addressing this huge burden of the next generation that can't buy a house. In some cases, they don't want to have kids. They're saddled with this debt. Address that and take some bold actions, further actions on climate. I completely agree that this is a low-hanging fruit. The president ought to do it.
Supporters of canceling student debt say it's one of the essential ways to address the increasing wealth gap in our country. But why stop there? Thousands of Americans are saddled with all kinds of debt, including medical debt, credit card debt, and more. Why not cancel all of it? At least that's what author and organizer Astra Taylor argues in her new piece, saying if the Biden administration is serious about, quote, Build Back Better, it needs to take bold action. This country cannot afford to allow millions of struggling households to sink when mountains of old bills and back rent suddenly come due once payment pauses and eviction moratoriums end. The government can and must find ways to make crushing debt disappear. Astra Taylor joins us now to discuss. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And so, Astra, I want to zero in first on medical debt. You know, the thing that the right has used to fight back against the push for canceling student debt is kind of an elite argument. Why should you allow somebody who went to Harvard and racked up a ton of debt, having a good time getting this elite education and getting their entry into the 1% as a result? Why should they have their debt canceled when everybody so many other people are struggling? Medical debt really rebuts that in a way, to me at least, in the sense that nobody thinks that a person who has medical debt got some privileged experience. They had some health crisis that led them to probably become hospitalized and then come out with that debt. So I don't know of those, which of those do you think are the most palatable?
Well, first I want to actually rebut the Harvard argument, because
Sure.
The truth is undergraduates don't come out of Harvard with very much student debt. Harvard has an enormous endowment that covers much of the student body. And a lot of the students who go to Harvard are rich. They have parents who can pay the tuition, their legacy admissions. So that's actually kind of a myth. And, it's a small number of students. The vast majority of people in this country go to public schools, to state schools, to for-profit colleges. So, as we like to point out, student debt is already means tested. The people who take out student loans do it because they have to. People from wealthy backgrounds, have their parents pay for college. So that is something
Right.
I think we really need to challenge out of the gate. But certainly medical debt is an example of a kind of debt that nobody is taking on willingly. It's not the same thing as going to a bank and to a loan officer and shaking hands and saying, yes, I will repay on these terms. Instead, you're in an emergency. You're literally going to the emergency room. People have enormous amounts of debt from medical emergencies, from the ambulances that they take to get there. Medical debt is the leading cause of bankruptcy in this country. So these debts, shouldn't exist on a moral level. And in many countries, with universal health care, they don't exist. The last thing I want to say about that is a huge percentage of what we call credit card debt in this country is actually medical debt, because people pay for these treatments with the swipe of a little plastic card because they don't have insurance, or they're, not, they have insurance, but actually it doesn't cover everything. So medical debt is absolutely a crisis. Again, a leading cause of bankruptcy, which means a leading cause of homelessness. We know experts are warning about a massive increase in medical debt post-pandemic. And I really do not understand the moral arguments for saddling people with this debt and allowing it to tank people's credit scores, which causes all sorts of really damaging consequences. So I think it needs to go.
I'm going back to the student loan debt question, though, because as a person, I guess, on the right on this issue, a lot of students who went to who got not the Harvard experience, but the other experience you were describing, they do have debt, but they have a more manageable amount of debt. The people who are really suffering, those people with 50, 100 more, $1,000. They did get something more, or they took out loans to get something more approaching an elite education. And I feel sorry for them that they kind of got scammed into this, because I think higher education, broadly speaking, can be a scam if you take out that much amount of money. But an issue, I think, with the one term and this the once-off kind of loan forgiveness, and even this is actually even true a little bit of medical debt, is you're not addressing the fundamental problem, which is the cost distortion, the bad incentives. You're not fixing the cost of these services, which is the real structural problem we have to address. You could wipe out all this debt, but then you'd still have debt, a few years from now, because you haven't addressed the root cause that makes people take out these loans and puts them in these bad situations. It would be good for these people, but what about the people right behind them who are still who are still going into debt?
Well, you've just made a wonderful argument for fully funding free public college for everybody, right? That is exactly right. We need to get to the root of the problem, which means we need something like college for all legislation coupled with a debt jubilee. This is an easy problem to solve. How do we know it's an easy problem to solve? Because it wasn't a problem a generation ago. President Biden certainly didn't take out $30,000 of loans to get his undergraduate education. In fact, I'm old enough to remember, and I've been organizing with the Debt Collective, which is a union for debtors I co-founded, long enough to remember the day student debt surpassed $1 trillion, which was in November of 2012. We are now at $1.8 trillion. So we may very well be protesting 2T Day, the day student debt surpasses $2 trillion under the Biden administration. Student debt was not even something worth measuring in the 90s. So this is a problem that has a public policy fix, and the Debt Collective has been dedicated to arguing that, right, that we need to couple tackling the problem at the source, which is publicly funding higher education, couple that with a debt jubilee. And what we've had to do is lay out the legal mechanisms by which that can happen. It turns out that the federal government, that the president and the Department of Education actually have the authority to cancel all student debt. And if it turns out that they do it once and they need to do it again and they need to do it again, well, that sure is better than pretending there isn't a crisis when there absolutely is. It's a crisis for people who are carrying six figures of debt, but actually this is a crisis for people with small amount, what is comparatively small amount, $10,000 or so. People default, has really tragic consequences on their lives. They can't save. We need to address this, and Joe Biden campaigned promising to address this. That's what we need to remember. He campaigned. Mm-hmm.
On the point of legal mechanisms around this, the Federal Reserve currently, it claims that it's going to be, unwinding its quantitative easing program, but the program is still in place. And what it does is it goes around and it buys up a bunch of corporate debt, a bunch of bank debt around asset-backed, mortgage-backed securities. From a more system-wide perspective, could the Federal Reserve be deployed in the direction you're talking about and buy up consumer credit card debt so that it would push down interest rates and you'd get a bailout of working people rather than using the Federal Reserve's kind of money creation abilities to simply pump money into banks and major companies?
I think that's a really important question, Ryan. I mean, when we talk about debt cancellation, it can seem very utopian until you realize that actually the 1% in corporations get debt relief all the time. Look at the 2008 bailout of the banks. When COVID hit last year, what you're talking about is there was massive quantitative easing. Essentially, the government bought hundreds of billions of dollars of corporate debt, bad corporate debt, for companies like Exxon, Walmart, for even payday lenders. So, why shouldn't regular people also get debt relief? And there's all sorts of creative mechanisms. Absolutely, the Fed could step in. Bernie Sanders, when he was campaigning, had a proposal that was essentially scaling up an initiative of the debt collectives, something called the Rolling Jubilee. We use it to buy and erase people's debts on the secondary debt markets. So he was saying the government would eliminate all medical debt in collections. The Fed can also issue, zero interest loans to municipalities. So there's all sorts of things that you can do. And the authority the Department of Education has to cancel student loans, federal student loans, is absolutely clear. And in fact, that authority has been used multiple times over the last few years by the Trump administration and the Biden administration. So if they would think half as creatively as they do to help corporations, to help regular citizens, we'd be in a way better situation as a society, because canceling debt would be an economic boost. It will create jobs. It will allow people to spend money on the things they need instead of just on servicing their debt payments.
Right. Well, Astra, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I want people to know we'll be protesting for student debt cancellation January 18th in Washington, D.C. So join the debt collective.
See you there. And we will have more Rising right after this.